And what I'm going to do in this short keynote address is try and carve out a bit of an intellectual space for this interaction, and try and map how these different themes are rubbing up against one another, complementing one another, challenging one another, but in many cases studied separately. So what I want to do is demonstrate that we need to start thinking about these things together, and that's what I'll try and do. One other set of thanks, I must also thank Carnegie Corporation, Hilary Weisner and Nihal for their ongoing support. Again, we couldn't do this without you, so thank you, both of you. Right, so citizenship and order. When we're looking at questions of citizenship, and I'm just going to try and move this remote control thing. When we're looking at questions of citizenship, we see that it's an institution of domination and alienation. Literature on citizenship articulates this quite nicely, that it processes, regardless of the definition of citizenship that you use, the act of making, regulating, ordering citizenship is a way of dominating and alienating. Put another way, it's a mechanism to define the inside and the outside. And I'll talk a bit more about that in a minute. Questions about citizenship are normative. There's a whole host of value-laden assumptions about citizenship. There's lots of different definitions of citizenship, lots of different ways in which citizenship plays out across states. Those of you that have kept half an eye on British politics in recent weeks will have seen that there are debates about citizenship revocation here in the UK that have parallels to a number of developments across the Gulf. But fundamentally, it's this institution of domination and alienation through attempting to define the inside against an outside. And the literature on citizenship typically is grouped into two different ways. There's state-citizen relationships, which for some are a little bit problematic because it's more state-centric. In some cases, it's Western-oriented, predicated on Western assumptions about statehood and ideas of belonging to states. But I think the dominant position of the state means that we cannot ignore the state's role in regulating life. That's one of the ways. The second way is more of a bottom-up approach. This assertion of political subjectivity through actions, and that citizenship is something that is gained through the actions of individuals, and it's more agency-driven. And this articulation of the political subjectivity of agency, albeit contingent upon the complexities and peculiarities of time and space. And just a quick note on time, I'll talk a bit about space today, but Nora Lori's keynote tomorrow will deal with questions of time, which is fascinating, related to her book on the subject. With these two schools of thought then, there are strong arguments for ascribing and following either one of those different approaches. But I think given the dominance of the state in the region that we're studying, given the dominance of state power, of sovereign power, the institutional mechanisms through which life is regulated, we can't really ignore that. And I'm going to focus more on the role of the states and the state ability to regulate the lives of citizens and non-citizens through this presentation. It's worth stressing, of course, that this is not without contestation. And the final part of my presentation will look at some of those ways in which the state is contested. And here we can see this playing out, the state as a means of regulating the lives of people through the cultivation of citizenship and inclusive and exclusive processes through what have typically been referred to as citizenship regimes, which is the laws, the institutions, and everything that is bound up in efforts to create the idea and the practice and the institution, if you will, of citizenship. And then there's the social contract, this idea of belonging to a political project predicated on a certain set of assumptions about how that society is ordered. So there's all of these things going on. There's clear articulations of sovereign power, and there's more normative, perhaps institutional questions about ordering and about the nature of a society. And I think this is where we need to look more in detail at what it means to be doing politics and the sort of the nature of states. And here the work of Ibn Khaldun I think is really helpful. For Ibn Khaldun, politics concerns the administration of the home or city in accordance with ethical and philosophical requirements for the purpose of directing the mass toward a behavior that will result in the preservation and permanence of the species. So here we can see two really interesting things. One, this sense that that all of the actions of the state and the rulers should be driven towards the preservation and permanence of the species. So it's about survival. It's about ensuring that people's lives can live on. And the state is the modern manifestation of some of those ideas. But the other interesting thing here is this idea of an ethical and philosophical requirement for the purpose of directing the mass. Now, anyone who's read Ibn Khaldun will know that Islam plays a really prominent role within his interpretation of political life. But there are other ethical and philosophical requirements, other ethical and philosophical dimensions that play an important role in ordering the relationship between a state, its rulers, and its peoples. And within that, of course, of citizens. So I think we need to start thinking about the role of the state and all of those things that are determining the actions of states and their relationship with people and the conditions that regulate those relationships. And part of this is something that is touched on again in the Muqaddimah by Ibn Khaldun, but it's also explored at length by philosophers such as Hannah Arendt and others, which is this idea of closing off against an other. So Khaldun is talking about the survival of the species, but he's also talking about this ethical and philosophical, these ethical and philosophical conditions that push a political entity in a particular direction. And there's a real sense of normative cohesion there. But that articulation of normative cohesion and the very essence of having a collective identity is to define it against what you are not. And this is something that Hannah Arendt has written extensively about, this idea that you are defining your identity by closing it off against an other. And that happens through creating the space in which legislation operates and the space in which people behave in accordance with a certain set of legal and normative rules and guidelines. And Arendt says here, outside of that space is lawlessness and, properly speaking, without a world. But by that she's meaning that it's set in opposition to that collective community. And Ibn Khaldun has written about this as well, this idea of fencing off parts of a garden. And he goes into detail here in this passage from the Muqaddimah. But there's a real sense of normative cohesion, of political cohesion, and this fundamental process of including and excluding that's bound up in the very nature of a polis. So immediately with the establishment of a polis, of a state, we have lines of inclusion and lines of exclusion. And what some of the panelists this morning have articulated is this sense that there are then different levels of citizenship within the polis. So even if you're included within the polis, it doesn't necessarily mean that you are automatically a citizen. And I think it's important that we identify the conditions that give rise to that, but also the ways in which it plays out and the efforts of a sovereign to order those different types of lines of inclusion and exclusion and the consequences of that. And here, the work of Deleuze and Guattari, particularly nomadology and the war machines, is quite interesting, which builds on the Arendtian notion of closing off against an outside. And that's what Deleuze and Guattari say here. The state is sovereignty, but it only reigns over what it is capable of internalizing or appropriating locally. So it relates to power. It relates to the ability to regulate that space. But these exclusionary visions also are bound up in problems. The image on the left of your screens is from the Tale of Antigone by Sophocles. And the Tale of Antigone is an interesting one that highlights the tensions between norms and law. And Antigone is essentially abandoned from the city, forced to leave the city for following what she believed was the right normative ordering, which went against the laws of the state. So she was previously a citizen of the state. She was someone that was included within all the different mechanisms of including and excluding. She was a very prominent member of society, but that failure of the state to fully internalize or appropriate all of the religious norms and customs and traditions meant that people were able to act against the state. And Antigone was one such example. And I think when we're looking at the region, we see this playing out in lots of different ways. We see it playing out, of course, through Islam and questions of the Ummah and loyalty to different broader communal groups beyond the state. And that, of course, is then driven by this sense of a normative ordering that the state is not necessarily able to appropriate or internalize. So even though you have an included collective, that included collective isn't necessarily homogeneous, nor is it fully appropriated if there has not been this successful internalizing of all the different other normative orderings. And this is one of the tensions that I'm trying to explore in future work and work that I'll be doing after Christmas. So it's sort of early stages, but those tensions I think are really interesting and really important. One of the ways in which states try to regulate the lives of people, citizens and non-citizens, is through constitutions. Described to me by one Yemeni that I interviewed for Houses Built on Sand as nothing more than ink on paper. Constitutions serve as a means of regulating life and ultimately ensuring survival. They set out that normative and philosophical, those philosophical conditions through which life should be run. And within this, identities, culture, and tradition provide the means to secure the legitimacy of the rulers. And ultimately, that allows sovereign power to operate. But much like the case of Antigone, you see identities, culture, and tradition also providing the means through which people can resist, providing the sort of the normative, the cultural, the traditional justification for acting against the state. And we look across the 20th century and we see countless examples of this, but perhaps the best known is the case of Juhayman al-Utaybi, a Saudi tribesman who in 1979 seized the Grand Mosque of Mecca on the grounds that the ruling Al Saud family was not behaving in a way that was sufficiently in keeping with Wahhabi tenets. So Juhayman al-Utaybi, and the case is a little bit more complex than that because it also includes the emergence of what he believed to be the Mahdi. Al-Utaybi was criticizing the Al Saud on the grounds of the very thing that they were using to legitimize their rule. So constitutions regulate life, but they also provide the means of possibly even going against the very rules that are set out. And what's really interesting here, I think, as well for our case, is that this embeds ideas of citizenship, of course, but it also embeds different forms of communal identities that don't necessarily run in accordance with the state identity. So, for instance, Arab constitutions all make reference to Islam and membership of the Muslim nation, and that runs contrary to this idea of a closed-off state, which is where you see all these tensions in the 50s, 60s, and 70s between the pan-Arab movements and the pan-Islamist movements. So you start to see tensions emerging from these questions about constitutions, leading to this Yemeni saying constitutions are little more than ink on paper. But there is, of course, a spatial dimension to this, and it's sort of all made real. Sovereignty is made real in the spatial ordering of society, which has very clear implications for citizens, for inclusive identities, and for exclusionary identities. So space for someone like Akile Mbembe is the raw material of sovereignty. It's the arena through which political life plays out in lots of different ways. It's a symbiotic process through which, as Doreen Massey says, the intimately tiny interacts with the global and the hegemonic. And this really plays out in urban planning and transformation. And I've put two images here. The first is from Jerusalem in 1967, the old city of Jerusalem, in which after seizing control of the old city, the Israeli Defense Force set about the urban transformation of the old city, and with it having very serious repercussions for various different identity groups included within the new borders of Israel, but excluded from lots of the different mechanisms of citizenship and belonging. So here you see the Western Wall, the holiest site in Judaism, and you see diggers, I guess you would call them. My son would call them diggers and get very excited. Having demolished what was the old Moroccan quarter of the old city of Jerusalem, the spatial transformation, the raw material of sovereign power made real. And in the middle you have the highway cutting through Manama, and you have images of the king, King Hamad, member of the Al Khalifa, in which you get this real, almost tangible sense of a sovereign entity ruling over the state, looking down, looming large over the traffic that's cutting across the road. And you can see just to the left of that image another photo. So there's a very clear reinforcement of Al Khalifa's sovereign power, and it's a spatial dimension, it's a spatial ordering. It's a very clear sense of this is a Sunni Arab monarchy. And if you are not members of those communities, then there is a very clear symbolic and structural violence that's going on. It goes back to what Jacob was saying about positive peace. This can have a very clear impact on the quest for positive peace through reinforcement of structural violence. But it's the sort of reinforces this absence of spatial belonging, an exclusionary process despite any rhetoric to the contrary. But what it does is this all shapes everyday processes of belonging. We've got two examples here, but scholars of Lebanon will have good examples about Beirut and the various different geographical areas of Beirut that are transformed and given particular meaning, becoming the physical bearers of identity, of a localized communal identity, some cases caught up in the national project, in many cases citizens, but not necessarily having citizenship as the main dominant identity. In other cases, of course, in refugee camps, that idea of citizenship is also excluded. So spatial lines of spatial factors are really important in understanding the regulation of life, but also the lines of inclusion and exclusion that we see bound up in the ordering of life, questions of citizenship and belonging. Now, the events of 2011 go some way in reinforcing these lines of inclusion and exclusion amidst the turmoil of the Arab uprisings and the various pressures that states were under, rulers facing serious pressure for reform or perhaps even fighting to survive. They deployed various machineries of control, and in doing so, they reinforced fluid lines of inclusion and exclusion, manifesting spatially and temporally. These differ across the region. They are driven by the complexities and peculiarities of time and space, of the different constitutional documents that give them power, of the different socioeconomic factors, the different political factors, and the levels of different forms of capital that they're able to deploy in pursuit of their own survival. In some cases, this results in the creation of what Giorgio Agamben terms bare life, the ability to abandon individuals into conditions of political exclusion, stripped of all meaning, stripped of all protections, yet bound by the law. And this is the case of Eman Salehi, the woman on the left of your screens, who's a Bahraini sports journalist who was killed for, I guess, cutting across the path of a member of the ruling family who shot her dead. He turned himself in to the police and was released without charge because of the ways in which the political environment in Bahrain had been shaped, the ways in which the deployment of machineries of sovereign power had been deployed, reinforcing fluid lines of inclusion and exclusion, and reinforced by the broader geopolitical developments of the time, which is why we've got this, this wonderful image of three wonderful world leaders. The other point I want to stress is that these lines of inclusion and exclusion are not necessarily fixed, and they can be incredibly fluid. So for instance, in 2011, Bahrain, you saw the harnessing of the use of Sunni Islamists by the ruling family in an attempt to cultivate lines of division between Sunni and Shia. So processes of sectarianization cut across the island, cut across the population, and were propagated by groups like the Muslim Brotherhood. But shortly thereafter, about 3 years later, the Muslim Brotherhood in Bahrain and other Sunni Islamists found themselves on the other side of that inclusive exclusion line as a consequence of broader geopolitical developments, notably Saudi Arabia's efforts to try and prevent the spread of political Islam. So this process of inclusion and exclusion is malleable. It's contingent on the peculiarities of time and space, and it changes very rapidly. And so we see all of this playing out across urban environments. Spatial regulation and biopolitics control affects belonging. It affects people. It affects communal relations with the state. It can deepen divisions within those included. So you can be a citizen and still feel excluded. You can be a citizen and still be in a worse position than some of those who are excluded from the state, but are included by virtue of class, wealth, ethnic background, for instance. So there are cross-cutting lines of division, and this was something that Tarek was mentioning in his presentation. Andrew talked about it in the case of Bahrain as well. Regulatory processes reinforce lines of division, but those lines of division are not always clear-cut. They're not always going to be citizen, non-citizen. They could include ethnic lines, they could include tribal lines, they could include religious lines, sectarian lines, political, ideological lines. There's lots of different ways in which these lines of division are playing out, but sovereign power and the biopolitical machineries of control are put in place to try and regulate that process of creating an in-group and an out-group. But whilst many states, many regimes continue to exert sovereign power seemingly at will, with very little scope for resistance, there is hope. This is an image taken in the souk in Manama in 2013, I believe. So not necessarily right at the heart of the Arab uprisings, but at a period when the Al Khalifa was exercising a great deal of its power. And it's a photo that I love for a number of reasons, but that's for another time. And despite this power, and I should say that shortly after taking this, there were raids across the souk, riot police were there, heavily armed police were there. So despite these ongoing displays of power, there are still examples of resistance. There are still people trying to circumvent state power. There are still people trying to push back. In Lebanon, for example, in Iraq, we see protests from 2019 onwards. John Nagel's written extensively on this in Ideas of Destituent Power, the ways in which LGBTQ plus groups have tried to use the sovereign power of the state against it, tried to make those systems inoperable. It's a term that Giorgio Agamben uses, but making the sovereign power of the state inoperable. And there is scope, there is resistance. And this resistance cuts across communal lines, it cuts across citizenship lines and questions of belonging and questions of sectarianism. And we see this playing out now. All of them means all of them. It is a common refrain heard in Lebanon. This is data from the 6th wave of the Arab Barometer. For some reason, it's got skewed slightly, but the two charts show satisfaction with the government's performance overall in your country on the left, and then trust in religious leaders on the right. And what you will see here is that there's not a huge amount of support in the country's position. There is not a huge amount of satisfaction. In fact, an overwhelming percentage are dissatisfied with government's performance, as you'll see in the sort of pinky purple part of the chart. Similarly, trust in religious leaders is not all that convincing. And what this tells us is that there is a growing frustration with the ordering of life along the lines of essentially communal lines, of political life dominated by the actions of elites who are associated to particular political parties with religious capital backing them up. And I guess that's hardly surprising, given that there have been protests since 2019. But it tells us that there is perhaps a desire to move away from identity-based politics, so politics defined by those divisions, defined by those processes of creating lines of inclusion and exclusion, to maybe more of an issue-based politics. And I'll get onto that in a second, sorry. So this is something that we talk about when we talk about desectarianization. It's a theme that we've been exploring over the past number of months now. And essentially desectarianization is to reject the dominance of sectarian identity in state projects. but particularly here in questions of citizenship and questions of belonging. What those engaged in desectarianization are essentially doing is reimagining the role of religion in everyday life. And we see this playing out in different ways. We see it playing out in bottom-up processes, those people on the streets of Iraq and Lebanon, with the chant KELLON, YANI, KELLON, this idea of expressing their frustration with political leaders and the lack of trust in religious leaders by demanding the reassertion of a collective national identity and interest-based politics over communal identity. So this is people trying to redraw those lines of inclusion and exclusion. And there's lots of different ways that that plays out, of course. There's a spatial dimension, but there's also interesting questions about where those lines of inclusion and exclusion are within a political project. And there's also, interestingly, top-down processes of desectarianization, such as what we've seen in Saudi Arabia in recent years, with Mohammed bin Salman trying to reimagine relations between Sunni and Shia. So historically, Shia groups had been subjected to widespread marginalization and discrimination, but in recent years, their position within the Saudi kingdom has changed dramatically. And for many, it's improved. There's some who would believe that it's all just a facade and that none of it really matters. But you see the urban transformation of sites across the Eastern Province, and you see regular photo opportunities and meetings of prominent Shia clerics and the Crown Prince. So there's perhaps something serious to that as well, redrawing those lines of inclusion and exclusion broadly within concepts of citizenship. But I think fundamentally what we're seeing when we see people take to the streets is this articulation of political subjectivity, its assertion of political subjectivity and performance of citizenship, reimagining the social contract, reimagining state-society relations. But I'll end here with this slide, which is, I think, the first time that we've shared any results from a CEPAD survey, which it's taken place over the past 6 months or so in Iraq and Lebanon. And what we're trying to do is look at ideas of belonging, community cohesion, collective identity, faith in, trust in particular leaders. And what we've done, and a huge thanks to Justin Gengler for doing the legwork on this, is looked at ideas of identity prioritization. You'll see Iraq on the left-hand side, Lebanon on the right. And what's really interesting is that political party and sect, often tied up with one another, are very low down. Religion, again, relatively low down. And different lines of inclusion and exclusion are starting to emerge, particularly tribe and family and nation. So, of course, this is a product of everything that's happened over the past 2 years, but reasserting political subjectivity is leading to new forms of identity, new forms of political engagement, new types of lines of inclusion and exclusion. I guess what remains to be seen, particularly in the Iraqi and Lebanese context, is what this means on the ground, what this means as the protests continue, and whether the quote-unquote fierce state, as Nazi Ayubi once talked about, will be able to try and once again mobilize its machineries of sovereign power to continue to assert the dominance of sect-based political parties. So there's a lot going on here, but I guess the conclusion is there's lots going on through ongoing processes of asserting political subjectivity and ongoing processes of negotiating and renegotiating those lines of exclusion and inclusion within political projects. And at stake is the very essence of what it means to be a member of a particular community and a particular state. And I think that's where I'll leave it. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Simon. That's very interesting. Lots of ideas and thoughts there. I'm sure it's more could be said and discussed. I wonder if we have maybe a chance for a question or two. If our audience have any pressing questions, perhaps they can put it in the Q&A
Can you see me, Elias?
Yeah, I see you. So maybe we'll just take one question just to leave some time for a break before our next session. But while that's happening, if I may, Simon, if I may ask a question, one of the links that I think is, has been surfacing a bit in the discussions and these discussions so far, and you somewhat alluded to it earlier, but maybe it needs further research, is the link between citizenship, the state and the citizenship, but also multinational corporations, profit-seeking, financial incentives, the capitalist system, all of that sort of world. How does that intersect with notions of citizenship and identity? How much is it driven by it? How much do we have control over this, considering the whole global sort of globalization? Is this something you explore? Is this something you've thought about?
I think it's a really interesting question in the sense that context matters, right? That as a Lebanese scholar and someone who's spent time in Lebanon and is studying, writing on Lebanon, you'll know all too well the devastating impact of the global economy on the Lebanese people.
Mm.
And I hope you don't mind me saying, but reading your chapters for your PhD dissertation, I think you open with something about Lebanon facing the worst economic crisis that the world has seen in X number of decades. And so it's a hugely devastating set of conditions brought about in part by rampant corruption and financial mismanagement, but also a product of global capitalism, I guess. And that, of course, is going to shape the conditions in which people are operating. Without the fabric of a strong state that's able to mitigate the various pressures of globalization and mitigate the financial demands of global markets and reassert some form of agency in the context of all of this, protect its people, then the markets are going to ride roughshod over a state, which will have a pretty devastating impact on people, as we're seeing. Now, I guess that can then play out in a couple of different ways. The obvious one is to develop anger, widespread anger at the state, which is what we've seen. And the state trying to claim money, trying to find any means of getting access to resources in the face of financial crises. So we see the WhatsApp tax, for example. That didn't work out too well for the Lebanese state, of course, producing widespread anger. But then if those precarious financial conditions continue and people are struggling to get access to money to pay their salaries, to pay for food, they're struggling to get access to medicine, healthcare, schooling, whatever it may be, petrol, then you start to see this retreat back into those more localized identities, right? And so you see in Lebanon, you see the reassertion of groups like Hezbollah, Amal, and various others who are seeking to control particular spatial environments, taking control of petrol stations, for instance. And it's that, I guess there's a question about basic needs somewhere in here. And if you're unable to meet your basic needs, if the state's unable to meet your basic needs, then you're going to turn elsewhere to make sure that your basic needs are met. And that can in turn lead to a reinforcement of those lines of division.
Yeah.
But I'd strongly say it's conditioned by the complexities of time and space. The Lebanese case is different to the Iraqi case, which is different to the Bahraini case, which is different to the Yemeni case, etc., etc.
Yeah. Thanks, Simon. That's helpful. We'll take one of Mustafa's two questions and then see how we get with Pam, or maybe other questions, just to give a chance for other people. So Mustafa's asking in the chat, how is the definition of citizenship along the lines of inclusion, exclusion, would end up overlapping or perhaps conflating with other concepts such as sectarianism, sovereignty, and order?
That's a really good question. I think what we're seeing is that they become consumed by, particularly claims to sovereignty and ideas of order. What we're seeing is, going back to Ibn Khaldun, an attempt to ensure the survival of the species, and the state and the sovereign state is the contemporary manifestation of that. And the sovereign, particularly the sovereign that has honed its skills and honed its ability to survive the regime, if you will, a more longer term manifestation of rule, has honed its ability to manipulate social dynamics, to consume those different communal groups, consume the ability to define the in-group and the out-group. So I think that ability to draw those lines is really key. We see that with processes of sectarianization post-2011, Bahrain, in Syria, in Yemen. Elite regimes, sectarian entrepreneurs sought to create lines of division as a mechanism of control. So I think it quickly becomes part of a portfolio of strategies designed to ensure survival. The interesting one, of course, is order. And I think here we have different forms of order, different levels of order. You have the local community discussions about order, which is what Jacob was getting at in his answer to me earlier on. This sense of very localized forms of ordering that offer a means of providing basic needs and protection. You see it in Iraq. You see it increasingly in Yemen, where the state has been hollowed out, and the only way of seemingly building up some form of life seems to be the very localized forms of order. This is something that Stacey Philbrick-Yadav has been writing about, and we've had numerous discussions about that, which has been really interesting. But then you also have national forms of order. The state seeks to impose a vision of order. But is this a vision of order that is in and of itself driven by a desire to survive, or is it part of a broader vision of order? So by that I'm meaning, are we positioning the state within a broader transnational vision of order? The easy example is perhaps the axis of resistance. A problematic narrative, of course, but a label that most of us would readily be able to identify. And the question is, for example, is Iran, is Syria, Hezbollah, Hamas, are they operating purely for their own ends, or are they operating in pursuit of a much larger collective goal, a collective vision of order? That idea of resisting against Israel, against the United States, against the Sunni Arab states, etc. And I think that's a really important question with regard to the mobilization of lines of inclusion and exclusion, whether it is done purely for its own ends, or whether it's done in terms of a much bigger picture. Let me give you the example of Bahrain. Post-2011, the Bahrainis engaged in a process of sectarianization, drawing lines of exclusion against the Shia population, against the indigenous Baha'ina population, framing all members of those groups as Iranian fifth columnists, doing the nefarious bidding of Iran. Now, this is something that is vehemently rejected by many, many people. One Bahraini Shia cleric told me that it was deeply offensive to lay such allegations there. But the question then is that about the Bahraini regime, the Al Khalifa, acting in such a way to ensure their own survival? Or is it them acting in a way to ensure their survival in accordance with broader visions of order? And by that, I mean Saudi Arabia. And you see the way that the Al Khalifa responded to the Muslim Brotherhood and other Sunni Islamists, which points to this sort of broader ordering. And that, I think, makes it an even more complex picture, because we're not just dealing with domestic politics here and domestic calculations, domestic decisions. We're dealing with more complex lines of inclusion and exclusion that are shaped locally, nationally, and transnationally.
Thanks, Simon. I guess part of that is there's a accumulation of events and circumstances that add up to the complexity. Yeah. So even looking at just the specific context, not only can you not look at it in isolation, but you have to consider the legacy and the history of how things have evolved and how things are, projected. So it's very difficult to untangle and to desectarianize, isn't it? It's an ongoing process, but important and necessary nonetheless.
I think you're right to stress the temporal dimension and the spatial dimension and the levels of analysis question, because what happens regionally at the transnational shapes the national, which shapes the local, but also the local shapes the national, and the local can shape the transnational, and the transnational can directly affect the local, which can affect the national, which can affect the transnational. So you have all these complex sets of relationships playing out across state borders, within state borders, across time and across space. And the presence of shared religion, shared ethnicities, shared history, shared culture, shared claims, shared visions of order, makes it an increasingly complex set of issues that's difficult to untangle. But I think it's a really important set of questions and issues.
Yeah. All right. Well, thank you very much again, Simon. This has been very insightful. Thank you for the insight and for the articulation. You've put your finger on a lot of important issues, and I'm sure there will be more of this in your books and things to look forward to. We are coming close to the end of this session, but we have another one coming in roughly at 2:30. So in about 15 minutes, or is it? Yeah, just about. So title of our next panel is Protest Movements, Identity, and Citizenship. Lots of interesting papers, as you can see. It's going to be very exciting. We hope you can join us. We're going to be on the same link. So we'll leave it here right now and come back in a few minutes. Thank you very much, everybody.